In Egyptian mythology, Ra, the sun god, and Apophis or Apep, who's a representation of chaos, battle regularly. During the day, Ra comes out, and at night he travels to the underworld, Duat, to hold off Apophis. Just a few weeks ago, we witnessed one of the most uncommon occurrences of Apophis swallowing Ra during a solar eclipse. But Ra is never able to be held in Apophis's belly. But what this means, however, is that Duat, the underworld, is the domain of Apophis, also known as Apep. And in this ancient theology, Duat was the path that every Egyptian must walk. The Book of the Dead, a 78-foot papyrus scroll from the 13th century BCE, is a funerary text that would explain the process for walking this path safely. The book tells a story from the perspective of its author, a scribe named Ani. Ani's journey begins with his death. Right. His body mummified, his organs removed and added to jars, but his heart is specially wrapped, replaced, and covered with a jeweled scarab. The wrappings are covered with spells that will help him pass through the underworld. When Ani reaches the underworld, he finds himself in a maze of caverns. Caverns full of scary monsters like snakes, crocodiles, and half-human creatures. But the worst of these is Apophis, who travels through this space and tries to devour the soul of Ani, who is walking through Duat. To prepare for the journey, he's buried with a scroll that is full of incantations and spells that protect him from these creatures. If, and it is a big if Ani makes it through these caverns, he will realize that his journey has just started. He comes to the halls of Ma'at following this part. Ma'at is the goddess that will in the end judge his morality. Ma'at has a very large staff, and not a stick, but a staff. She has 42 other gods that work for her. And Ani must go before these gods and give negative confessions regarding his life. He'll say, I have not committed sin. I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not stolen. I have not slain men or women. I have not uttered lies, etc. There are 42 of these negative confessions. Granted, many of his negative confessions will be lies. But that brings us back to the heart that is left in the body with a scarab. The scarab is inscribed with the words, "Do not stand as a witness against me," letting the heart know that it is not to utter the truth if it's in opposition to what Ani says. But it's as if the gods of the underworld know this trick, so that they have one more test. And this one can't be cheated. Ani comes to another chamber with Anubis and a large set of scales. Ani's heart, which was left in the body, is weighed on the scales against the feather of Ma'at. His heart must be lighter than the feather. For if his heart is heavy, he will be consumed by an alligator monster called Amit. But if it is lighter than the feather, Ra will take him to Osiris, who will transport him to the afterlife. As human beings, we can turn to mythology to understand our lives without necessarily accepting them as scientific truths. For example, I don't expect that my afterlife will pit me against Apophis, but that doesn't mean I haven't had to deal with the darkness here. I don't expect that I'll stand before Ma'at and her 42 staffers, but it doesn't mean I'm free to act immorally. I don't expect that I will have to balance my heart against a feather, but I still wish to avoid having a heavy heart. Mary Oliver understood a heavy heart. In her poem, Bitterness, she says this: I believe you did not have a happy life. I believe you were cheated. I believe your best friends were loneliness and misery. I believe your busiest enemies were anger and depression. I believe joy was a game you could never play without stumbling. I believe comfort, though you craved it, was forever a stranger. I believe music had to be melancholy or not at all. I believe no trinket, no precious metal shone so bright as your bitterness. I believe you lay down at last in your coffin, none the wiser and unassuaged. Oh, cold and dreamless under the wild, amoral, reckless, peaceful flowers of the hillside. So I felt a chill when I got to this part of the sermon, as I realized that this poem, like Ani's journey, is itself a set of negative confessions. Because any person who can look at this and not read, I believe, but I did not have a happy life. I was cheated. My best friends were loneliness and misery. My worst enemies were anger and depression, and so on. Anyone who can look at this poem and not place themselves in this space, it's not somebody I know. In my Mary Oliver poem book, underneath the poem, I have written a bunch of questions. Whose perspective is this? Who is the author speaking to? Is she saying get over it, or that our bitterness just doesn't matter? But it's the final 3 lines that give us the key to understanding this text. What does it mean that I believe no trinket, no precious metal shone so bright as your bitterness? She evokes dichotomy here, because bitterness does not shine. Bitterness is not associated with brightness and shininess. She's saying that you were so bitter that all anyone could see when you walked into the room was that bitterness, and that was all they could remember. I believe, then she says, I believe you lay down at last in your coffin, none the wiser and unassuaged. Which is, and you never even noticed. You never stepped outside of yourself to look. Then she says, oh, cold and dreamless under the wild, amoral, reckless, peaceful flowers of the hillside. To which she points out that in the end, the flowers of the hillside where you are buried, the places your ashes are sprinkled, the plot of our shell our shell finds its resting place, doesn't think twice about any of the bitterness that we lived in life. That place will be at peace even if you never were, even if I never was. But I keep saying you because Mary Oliver kept saying it. But maybe I can consider this a confession. If joy was a game I could never play without stumbling, comfort, though I craved it, was forever a stranger, I believe music had to be melancholy or not at all. No precious metal shone so bright as my bitterness. What if it's my bitterness? What if it's your bitterness? I think the poem is saying, if bitterness is all I ever knew, I will have missed the point of life. So I ask, how does a bitter heart weigh against Ma'at's feather? I think I could retitle this poem Resentment, and it would be fine. How much does resentment feed our bitterness? How much does resentment rob us of our joy? Peter the apostle comes to Jesus. He says, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive them? Now, this is the NRSV translation, which changes the word brother to member of the church, which I like and I agree with. But I think community would also be a good phrase. How many times should I forgive a member of my community that sins against me? And interpret that however you like. I have no qualms with your interpretation of whatever sin means. Jesus responds, or Peter says, should I do it 7 times? And Jesus responds, how about 70 times 7? And then he goes on to tell the story. There's a servant who owed his master a large sum of money. The servant fell down before the master and begged so that he wouldn't be thrown into debtor's prison. The master had compassion on the servant and canceled the servant's debt. Now, unconcerned about going to prison, what does the man do? Does he go about with his joy, and does he follow the process that his master goes on? How does he learn, or what does he learn from this event? And the answer is very little. The servant goes to another who owes him a small debt, demands full payment on the small debt. And since this third man is unable to pay the debt, the servant has the man thrown into debtor's prison and takes all his stuff. But the people around, they talk, see? They say, wasn't this the guy whose master just forgave a greater debt? So they ran to the master to tell him what happened. Suffice it to say, the master was a little unhappy, and it did not end well for the second man. But the point of the story isn't about masters and servants. It isn't about money, and it sure isn't about the ethics of debt repayment, though these things are part of the whole. It is about forgiveness. How many times should I forgive a church member? 7 times? No, 70 times 7. And I suspect that we can broaden this to not just church members, but to the people around us, to the lives we lead, to the people we don't necessarily like so much. The 7s evoke an eternal sense. It's a way of saying, always forgive. Never hold it in. But we don't like that. We don't like forgiving our debts to one another. We say we do, but we don't really. And there are many reasons for it. Some of them might be justifiable. And sometimes it feels like forgiveness denotes an approval of someone's behavior or actions. Though it doesn't. But it doesn't really matter. See, we don't forgive others because they deserve it. We forgive them because if we don't, we become filled with bitterness and resentment, and we become the person Mary Oliver was talking about. That no precious metals shine more brightly than their bitterness. I've come to you today with 2 ancient texts, one modern, and the thing about it that strikes me is that when you take these 2 texts, whether it's about forgiveness, the way to the heart, the analogies are always connected to a financial burden, because when Jesus taught folk to pray, he used the phrase, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. It's as if the things we hold against each other are stored in a bank vault of our soul, and they weigh down our heart. It is a bank vault that we prefer and would best have emptied. And when I put these 3 texts next to each other, it feels like it creates a sort of nexus. And in this nexus, we ask the question, what does my resentment say about me in my heart? And it's important to think of it that way. What does my resentments, what do my resentments, what is my bitterness? It's important when we hear things like this that we're looking at ourselves, we're not looking at the expectations of others. What does my resentment say about me? What does my bitterness say about my heart? Forgiveness and letting go is one of the most complicated and difficult things we can do. But for some reason, forgiving others is considered a weakness, when in truth, it is through that forgiveness that our hearts find balance. It's easy to hold a grudge. It's hard to let one go, especially when they don't deserve it. But the fact is, it doesn't matter, because forgiveness can be one of the most selfish things we ever do. Because to lay our burden down is one of the most important processes we will ever go through in life. To learn to live knowing that we've been at some point shunned or mistreated, that things have happened badly to us, that all these things in Mary Oliver's list have happened. We know that those have happened to us. But what we also know is that letting go of those things is what makes sure our heart does not weigh heavier than ma'at. We forgive because we have to. Forgiveness is the only way to find joy. It's the only way to find interdependence with one another. It's the only way to find unity, because we're in it when we're in a tight space, when we're in here together, we step on toes. I think it's why I like the phrase in the New Revised Standard, how many times should I forgive a church member? But it does transfer to everywhere else, because when we live life, life is messy. All the drama and crap going on in my head, I suspect is going on in your head too, just another different set of drama and crap, right? But we hold on to it like it's something we love, when in reality, the most wonderful thing we can do for ourselves is let go of that resentment, even when it means forgiving someone who doesn't deserve it. Thank you for listening.